Hello everyone, I'm Grandmaster Denes Boros, and this is a continuation of my Benoni days. This one is played against Smirnov Artem, one of those strong players from Russia, and I felt like, hey, this is a good time to try out my Benoni weapon. Let's take a look how it went. So, this is of course a d4 opening, e6, c4, c5. Now, I mentioned earlier that this e6, c5 move order was a specialty of mine, just like Raport's, who is a very strong super GM from Hungary. So c5, d5, takes, d6, knight c3, g6, and this is the whole point. I want my bishop to be on this long diagonal unopposed, and also giving the opportunity for myself to get the knight elsewhere. Now, there are some benefits and drawbacks, but it would definitely keep this bishop strong on this long diag. Knight f3, bishop g7, bishop f4. And my opponent plays one of the most critical lines of the Benoni, the bishop f4 system, because it immediately attacks this d6 pawn. Just a reminder how dangerous this is. Here, there could be two moves, knight f6 and a6, and I must play knight f6 as I did in the game. If, however, I would play a6 now, knight e4 would win the pawn immediately, and once this pawn is gone, black is near lost, because that's the pawn that holds the whole Benoni structure together. So that is why bishop f4 is such a dangerous weapon. So play knight f6, avoiding this knight e4 idea. e3, the other variation is queen a4 check, but e3 is also a line. Castles, h3. Now, this is a typical Benoni position. You've got a little bit less space, however, you're going to have active play. Different from what we've seen in my first game versus Brown Auric, the German Grandmaster put the pawn on e4 and it was an easier target to go after. But this time the pawn is on e3 and solidly defended by the f pawn. So there's two things I can do. I can try to put pressure on the e4 square, let's say something like bishop f5 and go knight e4. Or try to expand on the queen side, and that's the one I chose. I chose knight a6, preparing the idea of knight c7, b5. Now at first blink, bishop takes a6 is scary. However, it would give black the bishop pair, and very sound play on the b file, as the b file is opening up not only for my bishop but for my rook as well. But of course, Smirnov is an experienced player and plays bishop e2. Knight c7, castles. So notice, apart from preparing b5 pushes, I am putting this pawn under siege. So a6, a4, rook b8, preparing this idea of b5. If white would play a5, that still wouldn't bother me. I would go b5, and even if they en passant, I reach my goal. Yes, my pawn is a little weak, but the b2 pawn is much more important, because if I manage to win that pawn, I will have a c pawn and a connected pass pawn that is. So e4, rook e8. So basically I'm combining two ideas. I'm combining the idea of putting pressure on the e4 pawn while trying to expand on the queen side. And these two can work well together if timed, because I can go b5, b4, getting rid of this important defender on c3, and then the e4 pawn becomes victim of my vicious attack. Knight d2, Smirnov understands that and over-defends the e pawn. b5, a takes b5. So mostly, black's main problems come from the d6 pawn weakness and sometimes passive and undeveloped light ones. Now, the knight on c7, even though useful, isn't quite as good at this knight on c3, so I decide to take with my knight, because that would eliminate the defender and my threats on e4 would just get stronger. So knight takes, AB, bishop f3. Not a happy pose for that bishop. It is kind of like an honorary pawn. You would rather have a pawn there than a bishop. It's basically doing nothing. Now, this is a model position that I've got against Smirnov. I've got my bishop on a good spot. My bishop's a little passive, but it's kind of typical of the Benoni. If I could exchange it, I would, but my opponent was clever enough to play h3 and I couldn't trade it on f3 with a pin. However, it's still okay. It does some defensive jobs and might be useful later on in the game. So, with this bishop well placed, I still need to open it up. So, I can't really go knight d7 right now because that would drop the d6 pawn, and that usually leads to a quick collapse. So I played queen b6 first. Could have also gone queen c7 or queen e7. These are actually the typical moves. I can go queen e7 here. That is the more typical one. Or c7. Queen b6 is a bit more rare, but I felt that it feels comfortable there and it wouldn't run into any of these ideas on that queen. Queen b6, b4. So my opponent is trying to hold me back. Knight d7. And I'm very proud of this move, knight d7. Not only do I activate my bishop, but I am bringing this knight towards the queen side, from the king side to the queen side, to get better and more action. B takes c5, knight takes c5. Obviously, I'm going to take with the knight. Now, just a warning, you do not want to go c4 because the power comes from the dynamic nature of the Benoni. If you play c4, your pawns get rigid and white will have easy time maneuvering around and go for the e5 break. So that's why I went for knight d7, takes, knight takes c5, rook b1, eyeing my queen. Very, very tricky move. If I'd go knight a4, there's this neat idea of knight c4. I can't take because my queen would fall. So therefore, I just stepped away. Queen a6. Now rook a1 is not a possibility. I would take that. Therefore, white has to resort to waiting. Bishop g3, bishop d7. Not forgetting to connect them rooks. Rook e1, knight a4. And watch this track of my knight actually is going all the way through f6, d7, c5, a4 to c3 just to paralyze my opponent's pieces. In b3, knight c3, rook c1, b4. And it's time for me to use that extra pass pawn that I have. And that's actually the fun part of the Benoni. You get a very dynamic position with chances for both sides to win the chess game. Queen c4. Obviously, I don't want the trade because that would drop the d6 pawn. Instead, I go queen b6, bishop g4. Now, with bishop g4, I was very happy. It is well known that the bishop on c8, now on d7, is not such a great piece. So I took, rook c8. Now, if I go b3, the problem is that the knight would be hanging, and this pawn is not strong enough after rook b1. It's halted, and white gets a bishop and knight for a rook, which usually favors the side with the two pieces. So I played rook c8 instead, queen d3, b3. And this is the moment we sort of started heading towards the time trouble. My opponent found a very nice move e5, and suddenly I can't capture because there's rook takes c3, and there is no connection anymore between the bishop and the knight. So I had to choose whether to go here and here. I chose knight b5 because I felt that is the safest way of playing, but it turns out that queen b4 would have been much, much stronger, not fearing e takes d6 because I have b2, and even though I do get forked, sadly for white, there's this idea of taking knight e2 check, and at the end of the day, black is going to emerge with extra material on the board. So queen b4 would have been much stronger over defending this square and relying on the power of the passed pawn, which of course would have been a very thematic play. Now I played knight b5, which is not bad, but not as good as queen b4 would have been. Rook takes c8, rook takes c8, queen takes b3. And now this is your typical puzzle rush moment where you need to know what tactical tricks can come by. So I would advise you to pause the video here, take a little bit of time of yours, and then come back and see whether you can guess the move. Now, if you spend that little time to figure out this little puzzle, well, it all based on the idea of this pin on that king on g1. So I've played rook c3. You can't touch that because it's defended. Queen a4 and rook takes g3. And even though I won that piece, it kind of came on a very uncomfortable square. It can be taken due to the pin, but it's not where a rook should be. It should be on an open file where it just came from. So actually Smirnov has compensation. Knight c4, trying to lure my queen away, so can take on g3. Played queen c5, knight takes d6. Now here I played knight takes d6, and I think that was a decent choice. But it turns out that there's bishop takes e5, and knight takes b5, rook d3. There are some threats here. Rook takes c5, and black actually is not losing. There is quite a sequence here which manages to hold the draw. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but it is very, very pretty. Anyways, going back to the game, I took on d6, e takes d6, rook d3, and in time trouble my opponent played queen c6, and after queen takes d5 it's game over because I'm stopping the d-pawn, queen e8, and bishop f8, and here my opponent resigned as the d-pawn is lost and I'm up a whole piece. So I really hope you enjoyed this game I've played in the Benoni. If you have any questions about the Benoni, do post in the chat below what you think or what you'd be interested in. And please like, subscribe if you liked it, and hope to see you next time. Bye bye.